first boat they used was in 1845. A small boat called the Eudora that only carried freight. Eudora was Colonel Borden's niece, the daughter of Jefferson Borden. I believe his house still exists up on High Street someplace, right over there. Now, Bay State was not just a steamboat. I don't have any photographs. She was scrapped in 1864, and photographs started in 1865, so sorry about that. She wasn't just a steamboat. The average steamboat at the time was about 200 feet in length. The Bay State was 320 feet. It was the largest ship in America. Now, this is something I'm not sure everybody in Fall River knows. Probably more people traveled on the Fall River line than any other steamship company in America. This, I would say, maybe twice as many. Their steamers were the largest coastal steamers in the United States until 1913. They built larger ones on Great Lakes, but they didn't carry as many people. The Fall River line ran all year. The Great Lakes boats ran only about 6 months, if that. So even though the Great Lakes built larger ones, always the Fall River line was the best one. It was not only the best one, it was by far the best decorated, the most comfortable, the most elaborate. Taking a trip on the Fall River line was as much beauty and excitement as it would, far more beauty and less excitement than taking a cruise on the Mediterranean would be today. I was going to say earlier, I'm probably the only person alive who's actually been on board most of the Fall River line ships, but I can see I'm not. That's nice. The following year, 1848, they built a sister ship. Now, this is a photograph, but the Empire State later in its life was made into an excursion boat. And so what they did was to raise one of the decks up and turn it into a day boat. That's not what it looked like when she ran to Fall River. She too was, again, the largest on Long Island Sound. Now, can you hear me now? Any problem? Okay. Then one day in the middle of winter in 1849, the Empire State caught fire. And the fire trucks couldn't get there. They didn't have gasoline motor trucks, of course. They were hand towed. Of course, horses couldn't get through because the snow was about 6 feet high. So they quickly needed another boat. And one morning, Colonel Borden was sitting in his office, and the man who ran the Stonington line happened to be passing through Fall River, and so he came by to say hello. And how do you run your boat? And he said, oh, we're about to buy the state of Maine from a company up in Maine. Colonel Borden said, I have to go do some work in the other office. He went to his brother, said, get on the next train to Boston and buy that boat. Well, he got there. Incidentally, the man who was head of the Stonington line was Daniel Drew. And Daniel Drew, Jim Fisk, and Commodore Vanderbilt were the three biggest crooks in America. So Colonel Borden beat him out. State of Maine took over Empire State's route until she was completely rebuilt the following year. Then in 1854, the Fall River line built, again, by far the largest ship that ran in America. This was the Metropolis. She was 350 feet long. She was the fastest ship in American registry. She had the same engine, built by the same engine builder, as the ships that were running from San Francisco to China. There were 4 ships built to run from San Francisco to China the same year, and they had the same engine. The Metropolis could go as fast as any of the later Fall River line ships, about 20 miles an hour, a little more. She could make it from New York to Fall River in 8 hours. The schedule called for 12. She rarely did it. Oh, I should mention, you have cars probably. The faster it goes, the more coal it uses. And so the Metropolis was not only fast, she was bloody expensive. Okay. But marvelous ship, wonderful. I went backwards. 1864, in the middle of the Civil War, the Old Colony Railroad bought the Fall River Railroad and decided that they would like to extend it to Newport. Now, you must never tell anybody in Fall River this, but between 1864 and 1869, there was no Fall River line. It ran only to Newport. Got off at Newport, took a train to Boston. And they built a ship even larger than the Metropolis, the Newport, 4-stacker, marvelous ship. She's coming up the East River. You know the route, you've all been to New York, right? The docks are all on the North River. You can't be on the East River because the East River is not a river. It's a strait that runs from Long Island Sound out into the ocean. And it runs at about 8 knots. So if you pull out into the East River, you're halfway to the Statue of Liberty before you get underway. So most of the docks were on the North River. The North River had one disadvantage, that it iced, whereas the East River didn't. But anyway, they started on the North River, they went south almost to the Statue of Liberty, then did a complete U-turn up the East River, and then from there into Long Island Sound, past Fisher's Island, out into the ocean, then into Newport. Somebody is delivering a draft notice. Oh, thank you, Jim. Again, you know how old I am, right? But this thing is magnificent. Then, about this time, since the Metropolis and the Newport cost so much to run, and there was more business in the summer than in the winter, from this time on, the Fall River line ran 2 large boats in the summer and 2 smaller ones in the winter. That's a better view than Newport. Same picture. They built one called the Old Colony to replace the Bay State. The Bay State was having trouble. Her engine never worked properly. So they took the Bay State apart and took her engine and put it in the Old Colony. You figure it out. Old Colony was a nice one. Okay, now, 1860. In 1867, the unthinkable happened. Somebody decided to build ships bigger than the Fall River line ships. The people who did it went broke. They decided to start a line from New York to Bristol. Now, Bristol isn't much farther than Newport, but it's it's a lot closer to Boston than Newport. And so it was going to be faster. And they had a lot of capital. And they went to William Webb, who was the most important shipbuilder in Manhattan, to build 2 beautiful, enormous sister ships, the Bristol and the Providence. But they went broke. And so the person who picked it up was the crook from Vermont, James Fisk. I know my family comes from Vermont, and that's sacred. But nevertheless, he was from Vermont, and he was a crook. He had made himself a fortune selling inferior and bug-ridden blankets to the Army during the Civil War. We're still doing it. Okay. The Bristol and the Providence, once Fisk got a hold of them, they were dolled up to look like Mrs. Astor's living room, and with strange colors and birds in cages and palm trees. It was the event to go to Bristol on the Bristol of the Providence. They even wrote a play about it called something, Fun on the Bristol, I think. Look at that. She has 2 full decks. They're the largest ships yet built for local service with wooden hulls. So what eventually happened was that the Newport line and the Bristol line merged. But the Newport line had a great deal of Fall-River capital in it. And so the Fall-River capital said Fall-River is the terminus for all of the ships. And so from that time on, they ran to Fall-River. They stopped at Newport on the way, but they ran to Fall-River. And they were called the Fall-River line. Bristol and the Providence were the summer boats. Now the Newport and the Old Colony were the winter boats. And these were the grandest ships in America. No question about it. There's interior of the Bristol. By the way, some of my best interior photographs are in another carousel that I couldn't find. So we'll do our best. Love the carpet. This was after the Fall-River line took it over from Fisk. No more birds. Okay, that's the deck plan. You can see it? Sure. Let me give you a clue here. There are 2 decks, and they're superimposed on each other. And you can't see it anyway. Okay. There are 2 decks superimposed on each other. Now, in the middle is all the engine stuff, the working beam, stacks, all that stuff. Forward is a grand staircase from the main saloon up to what we call the gallery deck. And forward of that stairway is a large well, so that the forward part of the saloon deck is 2 decks high with a balcony around and staterooms on them, and the same thing aft. Aft of all the engine housing, another grand stairway, etc. What did I get? That's the other one, the Providence. I'm still standing. Not too well, yeah. Oh, okay. I don't want to get in the way of the picture. Oh, that's good, thank you. Isn't that nice? There she is coming into dock in Newport. Providence. I was about that age when I was looking at the Priscilla. That's my favorite ship. Aha, 1883. In 1879, the Fall-River line bought a large number of docks in Newport. And in Newport, they created their own facilities. Now, they didn't have a dry dock. So once a year, those ships had to go to dry dock to get their bottoms painted. Can I say bottoms in a church? Oh, okay. Anyway, they went to New York to do that. But otherwise, all of the work was done at Newport by employees of the Fall-River line. Usually 200 or 300 people. And the ships each had about 200 in crew. And there were 4 ships. So the Fall-River line is probably one of the major employers around here, even as much as most of the mills. Okay, in 1879, that same year, they hired a man to supervise. His name was George Pierce. He was a naval architect, and he designed all of the next several ships of the Fall-River line. The first one he designed was the Pilgrim. She was the first ship on Long Island Sound with an iron hull. There were smaller ones before her, but not that large. She's over 400 feet in length, by far the largest ship in American registry. She was known as the Iron Monarch. And she also had a double hull, first ship on Long Island Sound or on the American coast with a double hull. So that if she hit something, scraped open her hull, she would stay afloat. Magnificent ship. This really made the Fall-River line, something like the Pilgrim. Now, several years later, George Pierce produced a consort. Oh, there's the Pilgrim again, sorry. This is also the Pilgrim, standing on the top deck looking forward. Gives you a sense of the size, I think, of 400 feet. Queen Mary is 900. So it's half the length of the Queen Mary. That's the interior of the Pilgrim. The Pilgrim was in many ways a copy of the Bristol and the Providence, longer and with an iron hull. Oh, George Pierce also built 3 freighters for the Fall River line. They found it was cheaper to have slow freighters that didn't use as much fuel to take much of the cargo. They took a tremendous amount of business. In addition to all the fabrics, by this time, Providence is developing in leather manufacture. Newport is exporting fish. I don't know where else. You probably know better than I do. But they did an enormous amount of business, both passengers and freight. And they kept 1 or 2 freighters every night, in addition to the large passenger steamer that also had cargo area. The next ship that Pierce produced is the Puritan, to run with the Pilgrim. A totally different kind of ship, if you look at it. He had devised by this time something called a feathering paddle wheel. Now, if you think of a paddle wheel as, sort of like a water wheel, all of the spokes are directly out from the center. In a feathering side wheel, they hinge so that they drop down, and that way they enter the water perpendicularly, they push perpendicularly, and they come out perpendicularly and go around like this. That way, each one of the blades gets the full force with minimal drag, if you follow all that. Okay. Therefore, they could be much smaller. And because they were smaller, George Pierce hid the wheels behind fake stateroom windows. And this was the case on all subsequent Fall River ships. You couldn't tell that they were side wheelers, unless you pretty well knew that. Okay. It is the opinion of most of us members of the Steamship Historical Society that the Puritan is the most beautiful ship ever built. This is George Pierce. Now, if you look at the guardrail is right over the hull, right? It is a circle. It is an arc of a circle. Each deck from there up is the arc of a larger circle, so that when you get to the dome on the top, it's flat. This doesn't sound like much, but it produced a really graceful ship. Note too, he hid the walking beam inside the dome. But because he had the dome up there, he didn't want the ship to look top-heavy in the center, so he put the pilot house along forward. All of this, and then the smokestacks between. 2 smokestacks close together, quite far forward. This is to be a trademark of the Fall River line for the rest of its history. I'm not going to talk, just look. Isn't that beautiful? Beautiful. There she is in New York. You should read the newspapers in June of 1889 when she first appeared. There she is, totally different from any other ship. Oh, sorry. Geez, oops. The plan of the Fall River line was to run the Pilgrim and the Puritan in the summer and the Bristol and the Providence in the winter. Because now the great Bristol and Providence are in fact small. The Pilgrim and the Puritan are so much larger. But the Bristol one day caught fire in Newport on December the 31st. They got celebrating a little early, apparently. And December 31st, 1888. Okay, now you've got 2 big ships and 1 small ship. What are you going to do? For the first time, the Fall River line built a ship that was smaller than the last one. In other words, to replace the Bristol, not to outdo the Puritan. And is that Plymouth backwards? Well, it doesn't matter. It's the Plymouth. Another steamer, and I was invited into the pilot house, and the stupid captain pardon me, allowed me to steer. Now that I'm older, I think, good grief. Well, he did, and when he told me to steer, he told me to put the jackstaff up against the stack of the Plymouth, which was running ahead of us. Okay, I mention this because it started a love affair with the Plymouth that I have never gotten over. I have a model of the Plymouth in my living room, and if I get depressed, I look at it, and it's not that easy, but it makes a good story. Okay, the Plymouth had a totally different kind of engine. This is the engine of the Puritan. The cylinder is upright. The steam goes into the cylinder. The steam goes into the cylinder and pushes a piston directly up. The piston going directly up moves the walking beam, which is on top of the ship, on a fulcrum, and so pushes it up. When it goes down, it's attached to the side wheel shaft and goes around. You follow? Now you know you can build an engine. Okay. Plymouth. The Plymouth had what they called an inclined engine. It did not have a walking beam. There were several cylinders facing each other, each with pistons, and the pistons went around this way on the shaft of the side wheels. It meant that all of the weight was in the hull, so the ship was much more stable, and the ship was much cheaper to operate because they used what they call triple expansion on the Plymouth. Triple expansion means that the steam goes first into one cylinder, and then after the piston pushes the steam out, that same steam goes into another cylinder and is used a second time, and then into a third one and is used a third time. The Plymouth, therefore, used about 1/2 the coal of either the Puritan or the Pilgrim. But bear in mind, this is 1890. Coal was nothing. Later, it was going to be a problem. 1894, Pierce took all of the concepts of the of the Puritan, and built a new ship called the Priscilla, which was somewhat larger. Puritan was 420, this one was 440, and used the incline engine of the Plymouth. She came out 1894. And I remember seeing the Priscilla in 1937 and talking to the engineer, and he said that her engine was in just as good shape in 1937, 43 years later, as it was in 1894. She was in excellent condition. What I don't have is pictures of the Priscilla's interior. I recommend that you go to the Marine Museum. You have a museum right here in Fall River called the Marine Museum. Nobody ever goes to it, but it has a model of the Puritan. There again, if I can't go to heaven, just put me in front of that model of the Puritan. I'd be perfectly happy for all eternity. They also has a model of the Priscilla and many photographs of the Priscilla's interior. It was fabulous. It looked like Disneyland of 1894. Now, this same year, the Fall River line was purchased by the New Haven Railroad. Okay, it's more complicated than that. They belonged already to the Old Colony Railroad. The Old Colony Railroad was bought by the New Haven Railroad. By this time, the Old Colony also owned the Providence and Stonington line. That meant that there were smaller steamers running from New York to Stonington and New York to Providence. Nothing like the Fall River line. So the New Haven Railroad now owns 3 big steamship companies, including the Fall River line. Priscilla was magnificent. There again, pardon the memory, crossing on a ferry once across Long Island Sound. I remember I was so hot, and my father said, "Oh, here comes one of the night boats." And as it got closer and crossed right in front of us, I remember my dad saying, "Oh, it's the Priscilla." This wasn't just a night boat, it was the Priscilla. It was everybody's favorite. It was, they call her the Mauritania of Long Island Sound. beautiful ship, beautiful. She was fast, too, by the way. She was as fast as the Metropolis. I thought I was putting the interior of the Priscilla. It isn't. It's one of the smaller ones. Here's the Priscilla about to leave New York. Okay, from 1894 to 1908, 14 years, the sister ships, or the consorts we call them. Someday they're going to invent a remote control that doesn't have wires. Were the Priscilla from one end and the Puritan on the other in the summer, and then the Pilgrim and the Plymouth operating in the winter. Then in 1897, somebody got a clever idea. The Providence line only runs in the summer. Therefore, if the Pilgrim and the Plymouth are only running to Fall River in the winter, we'll run them to Providence in the summer. So from this time, the Providence line becomes part of the Fall River line. In other words, if they sail from the same dock, if somebody's going to Boston and the Fall River ship was overcrowded, they'd just say, well, we'll find you a room on the Providence boat. And they'd say, but we want to be on the Fall River line. And the answer was, but it is a Fall River line boat, either the Pilgrim or the Plymouth. There she is. There she is. Go in the right direction. Same picture. I turned it around so you'd think there were two. 1905, they did something awful. They decided to build a ship to replace the Pilgrim. You know, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. The Pilgrim was a wonderful ship, a beautiful ship. By this time, George Pierce had died, and so the ship was not designed by George Pierce. It was designed by Howland Gardner, who'd taken over. It had all of the Fall River line characteristics, and it was a lovely ship, but she wasn't the Priscilla. Now, the Providence was much larger than either the Pilgrim or the Plymouth. She had the largest freight capacity of any ship on Long Island Sound. And so she could run in the winter, and she often, usually in the fall, they ran the Priscilla and the Providence, right up to modern times, in fact. She's fine. Her only problem was she wasn't the Priscilla. Okay. Her consort on the Providence route now was Plymouth, or on the Fall River line in the winter. Oops. March 26, 1906, the Plymouth burned. This time they didn't replace her, they rebuilt it. And they rebuilt it even more beautiful. But the Pilgrim got a reprieve. She ran for another year while they were rebuilding the Plymouth. This is the Plymouth after she was rebuilt. Where is that? That's near here somewhere, isn't it? I think that's taken from the Mount Hope Bridge. No? Okay. Well, until I hear otherwise, it was, okay. I always test my classes to see if they actually know anything. Chances are they don't, so if I don't know what I'm talking about, I'll make it up. If there are any teachers here, you all do the same, I know. This is Plymouth. Okay, in 1908, something strange happened in 1907. A man named Charles Morris from Maine built two large, fast, beautiful propeller ships called the Yale and the Harvard, and began running them from New York to Boston direct. So you could leave New York on the Yale or the Harvard at the same time that the Fall River line steamer left, and it would get to Boston at the same time as the Fall River line boat train got to Boston. On the Fall River line, you get up at 5 o'clock in the morning to change to a train. And this was really bad news for the Fall River line. Aha! But the Fall River line was owned by the New Haven Railroad. The dominant figure in the New Haven Railroad was J. Pierpont Morgan. J. Pierpont Morgan managed for Morse not only to go bankrupt, but to go to jail. And the Yale and the Harvard suddenly went to California. And the Fall River line then built the largest ship ever built for Long Island Sound, the Commonwealth. There's no question the Commonwealth was the grandest ship on the Sound. Her interior was magnificent. She had an upper deck dining saloon that was equal to any hotel in the world. She had one problem. She wasn't the Priscilla. She didn't look like the Priscilla. She had all the fall-over-line characteristics except no masts, but she wasn't the Priscilla. And so there are two kinds of fall-over-line passengers. The ones that want the Commonwealth because she was elegant. She was really elegant. And those who just loved the Priscilla and always would, and would plan their trips on the Priscilla. And the Commonwealth and the Priscilla remained the fall-over-line summer steamers from 1908 to 1937, almost 30 years. And they're the ones that some of us remember. The winter boats were the Plymouth and the Providence, right? Plymouth and the Providence ran to Providence until 1917, and then they gave up the Providence line. And for the summer of 1918, it was during the war, there was so little traffic, and they had to change the schedules because there was a submarine net at Newport, and you had to leave before sunset, and you had to come in after sunrise. So there were so few passengers, they just ran the Providence and the Priscilla. But in the summer of 1919, the Boston line was still running, but with very small ships. And the fall-over line, in the middle of July, suddenly discovered they couldn't carry everybody aboard the Priscilla and the Commonwealth. Either one could carry 1,000 passengers, mind you. And so they ran 4 boats during the summer for the next several years. The Commonwealth and the Plymouth, the largest and the smallest from one side, and the Priscilla and the Providence from the other. That is, on any summer night, there could be 2,000 people traveling in each direction between Fall River and New York. Then 2 things happened, and 3 things happened in the middle of the 1920s, just a little before our time. 1924, they built 2 large modern ships to run between New York and Boston. They were called the Boston and the New York. It's hard to remember. They were modern. They had dance halls. The New England Steamship Company never had a dance hall. They were modern. They were sort of like cruise ships. 2, the automobile and the truck. Whereas the easiest way to get fabrics from Fall River to the fabric area of New York was by steamship, because the fabric area of New York is downtown, and there's no railroad that runs into Manhattan with freight. You take passengers, but not freight. With the truck, you can take cargo from door to door. And if you take a steamship, there are 2 or 3 transfers that involve human labor. And the freight on the Fall River line, I've looked at statistics, it went down to 1/3 during the 1920s. Because also, another thing that happened was that somebody finally figured out that you could have fabric factories in the South, and that labor was a great deal cheaper in the South than it was in Fall River. And so, as you well know, the Fall River mills just disappeared. And with that, most of the business of the Fall River line. So 1927 was the last year they ran 4 boats. After that time, they ran the Plymouth and the Providence to New Bedford during the summer to pick up what revenue they could, but they were empty. I can remember that. And the Commonwealth and the Priscilla, really after 1928, the Commonwealth would come on 1st of June, and she'd be finished by the 1st of September. And so the Fall River line was maintaining this enormous ship 12 months a year and running for revenue only 3 months a year. So the handwriting was on the wall by 1928, but they weren't quite ready to accept it. There's no reason, oh, I know why the Puritan was there. The coming of the Commonwealth meant the end of the Puritan, and she wasn't even 20 years old. But the Commonwealth was much larger, much grander, And she was actually cheaper to operate than the Puritan. Okay, on the Pilgrim too, they both went. Okay, now, Commonwealth, Priscilla. I'm just showing you pictures. Providence, Plymouth. These ran through the 1930s, but with pathetically few passengers and very little freight, very rapidly declining freight. The Fall River Line stopped making a profit in 1929. Their loss was minimal compared to Enron, but it was about $200,000 a year. But by 1936, it was close to $100,000 a year. And the New Haven Railroad, which owned it, was bankrupt. So they didn't want something that wasn't making money. That's my favorite ship. I'm sorry, we're going to just look at it. I love her. There's the Priscilla about to leave New York. That's the interior of the Plymouth after she was rebuilt. One of the small ones is the upper deck of the Plymouth. The Plymouth was a Maverick. She only had one stack. There's Providence in Newport. I'm just playing with you. During the summer, the Providence line did not have a sailing on Saturday nights, but they did on Sundays. That meant that both boats were in Providence on Sunday. So one of them took an excursion to Martha's Vineyard or New London or something. What happened was then about 7 o'clock at night, or no, pardon me, 8:30 or so in the midsummer, the steamer going to New York and the steamer coming back from Martha's Vineyard would pass. So this is what's happening here. That's the Providence going to New York. That's all Providence. That's the quarterdeck. On the main deck, after the freight deck, that's where you entered, and the purser's office was there, and that's where you got your keys and stuff. Plymouth leaving New York. I remember that. That's a painting in my house of the Plymouth. Oh, come on, isn't that beautiful? That's George Pierce's boat, magnificent. Okay, now, these are just pictures. You gotta look at the Puritan again. She was beautiful. Okay, that is to indicate that I'm almost finished. 1937. In April 1937, the New England Steamship Company that ran the Fall River Line announced that they were giving up its Providence line and its New Bedford line. The understanding was that the Fall River Line would continue, but there was a problem. The Morro Castle fire in 1934, you remember that? Thank you. Off the coast of New Jersey, had brought about a lot of new rules about safety at sea. The Commonwealth had it, the Providence had it, the rebuilt Plymouth had it, the Priscilla did not. Also, the Plymouth was getting old. This is 1937, she was built in 1890. So the only really serviceable boats were the Commonwealth and the Providence. The Commonwealth was too expensive to run all year. Okay, question, do you run just the Plymouth and the Providence with the understanding that nobody's going to take them because the Fall River Line meant Commonwealth to many people? They decided in 1937, okay, we'll run the Commonwealth and Priscilla one more year, but if anything goes wrong, we can't keep it up. They were losing money. They were crowded, but they were crowded 3 nights a week, 3 months a year. The rest of the year, they weren't making any money at all. The freight had practically disappeared. So, the Commonwealth and the Priscilla ran happily through June. Then in July, again, I see some of you will remember, the strikes. It hit the whole country, right? And we weren't prepared for it. Nobody knew how to handle it. Priscilla was in New York one night, over 1,000 people, paid, ready to sail, and captain was informed that the crew would not sail. The same thing happened in Fall River. The Commonwealth was in Fall River. That was July 13th, 1937. They never sailed again. They weren't making money anyway, and to lose 2 or 3 nights during the summer to strikes would have cost them more than they were making. They couldn't do it. And the New Haven Railroad was looking for an excuse to get rid of the Fall River line. Commonwealth was tied up at Fall River, across from the museum. Priscilla was towed to Providence, and the old Providence line dock. Plymouth and Providence were both in Newport already, because they were the winter boats and they weren't running in the summertime. In a way, I was lucky. My father worked for a different steamship line and he wanted to see what they looked like. I was 10. He took me with him. And we went on board the Plymouth and we went on board the Providence. We went on board the Priscilla. We didn't come to Fall River. I was only 10. I'll never forget it. My father's line was a competing line. I couldn't care less. Those were beautiful, beautiful ships. They really were. In October of 1937, the $1,000 for all 4 ships. The Commonwealth had cost $3 million to build. One by one, they were towed to Baltimore. And in Baltimore, they were scrapped. Plymouth, that was where she was in Newport toward the end. Providence, Priscilla, Commonwealth. It was all over. Thank you.